Welcome to the NCD Alliance webinar. I would now like to turn the call over to Dain, Executive Director of the NCD Alliance. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Good morning, afternoon or evening everybody, and welcome to the NCD Alliance webinar. It feels like it's been a while since we had our last webinar, which I think took place in October. I think that's partly just because an awful lot's been happening at the global level in the last couple of months. So today our webinar will focus on a number of different items. We'll be firstly updating you on the Global NCD Alliance Forum that took place just a couple of weeks ago in Sharjah in the UAE. Cristina Parsons Perez from the NCD Alliance will be presenting on that item. Secondly, we'll be updating you on where we are in the IAEG Sustainable Development Goal Indicator process. Priya Kanayson from the NCD Alliance team will be updating you on that. We'll also have an update from Jess Beagley from NCDA on climate change and the recent COP21 which took place in Paris and the implications of that from an NCD and a health perspective. Fourthly, we've got a guest speaker today. We're very pleased to have Bonnie Keith, Helen McGuire and Jana Armstrong from PAS who will be talking through a new report they have put out on access to essential medicines and technologies for NCDs and a related call to action. And then finally, we'll be having an update from myself on activities from the World Health Organization on NCDs and looking towards the WHO Executive Board in January. And finally, I'll just be giving a quick overview of NCDA priorities moving into next year, into 2016. So with no further ado, let me hand over to Cristina Parsons Perez, who will talk us through the recent Global NCD Alliance Forum. Cristina.
Hi everyone, it's good to be here today at this NCD Alliance webinar. So the Global NCD Alliance Forum, the first Global NCD Alliance Forum ever, just took place on the 13th to the 15th November this year in Sharjah, the United Arab Emirates. And the forum was first conceived as a flagship initiative, part of the increased work and attention that the NCD Alliance is giving towards national and regional alliances, and this is as prioritized in the strategic plan of 2016-2020 of the NCD Alliance. And this really reflects the thought that we have a series of global commitments in place where we have targets, indicators, a global action plan, a series of very high-level political commitments, and the declaration of 2011, again last year with the review in 2014, and really the landmark events of the United Nations in New York this September just passed, where NCDs have been officially embedded in the Sustainable Development Goals and the Agenda 2030, and the very kind of landmark target established there as well of a goal of having by 2030 reducing the premature deaths caused by NCDs by 30%. And so this realization of a very changed global policy landscape and these commitments that are all to be celebrated in order for us to meet these very ambitious goals and really to save lives and reduce mobility. It is a very it's crucial that we now really move from global commitments to local action. Hence the prioritization of the NCD Alliance towards the pivotal regional and regional and national NCD alliances, and the strengthening of advocacy and accountability efforts. So the Global NCD Alliance Forum really symbolized the first time that civil society on NCDs was brought together. And they were brought together under the banner theme of NCD advocacy and accountability in the post-2015 era, and the forum focused on three key areas. So advocacy and accountability, translating global commitments to local action, and organizational development, that idea that NCD alliances are really key towards as driving forces for change, and so discussions in the forum about what makes effective NCD alliances, and finally the notion of collaboration for success. So twinning, be it north-south or south-south, what are the type of collaborations and partnerships that are going to enable change to be implemented and for change to happen. The Global NCD Alliance Forum was made possible thanks to the very generous support of the patron of the forum, Her Highness Sheikh Jawahar Al Qasimi from Sharjah, UAE, and the organization that she was the founder of Friends of Cancer Patients. We're the local host organization, and this very high-level support. We also see here this photograph of the ruler of Sharjah himself actually speaking at the opening ceremony of the Global NCD Alliance Forum. Next slide, please. So the real focus then of the forum was on bringing civil society together, providing a safe space for networking and knowledge exchange, where people could share good practice to really build a sense of community. This is a very young movement after all, and really providing a platform for strengthening advocacy and coordinating activities. So the forum was attended by invitation only. We had 229 a total of forum delegates, of which a very significant percentage were representatives from national and regional NCD alliances, and we made sure that we had representation that was geographically representative, so from all the different world regions. And we also had global health stakeholders that were very kind of carefully selected with the idea of promoting networking and partnerships. So we had a series of organizations with alliance structures themselves and networks at their fingertips. And just a couple of examples, we had like the Global Network of People Living with HIV, for instance, the Global Alcohol Policy Alliance. So we had several international NGOs as well as a very solid national presence. So we had representatives, for instance, from health authorities of the different United Arab Emirates. And we, of course, also had representatives from the NCD Alliance, from federations of its steering group, representatives from the local host organization, as well as the NCD Alliance Supporters Consultation Group, an interesting blend of private sector and NGOs there. And then we had this very interesting constituency of youth and patient advocates. Next slide, please. And this group consisted of the aim when the forum organizing and planning got underway was we specifically set out the aim of having 10% of delegates be youth and people living with people affected by NCDs. And the thinking behind that was that these are very powerful voices to the movement, and so we really wanted to bring these voices to the forum to be able to share what they can do to forward the global NCD response. So we tapped into a series of different long-term collaborating organizations with the NCD Alliance to receive nominations of outstanding advocates. So individuals that had a track record in NCD advocacy, as well as individuals that have a multiplying effect. So again, that idea that we want to connect the different individuals at the forum with NCD alliances in different countries and across regions, and having these individuals bringing more of their own communities to this movement. So we were able to tap into organizations such as NCD Child, for instance, the Young Professionals on Chronic Disease Network, the IDF Young Leaders Program, and several others. And I think that this brought a very special flavor to the forum, if you will, and this was pointed out by many delegates as a highlight of their forum experience, was to actually connect with these individuals. Next, please. Now, the forum program was built with the support of a planning committee, and the program was focused on 2 days, and it was built around the structure of having 3 plenary sessions and 3 workshop streams, where we would have a plenary session offer some high-level comments by recognized world experts in the field. And these would be, we also had panelists have a more informal type of discussion of remarks given by a keynote speaker. These plenary sessions were followed by workshop streams, each one with 4 concurrent workshop sessions, where we could really drill down to key areas that had been identified in the plenary session. So in the workshops, this is where individuals and delegates got really to speak to each other and hear about those best practices and what different NCD alliances are doing and what different countries are doing. So really it was there to really kind of promote this best practice exchange and networking. We also had a facilitated networking session and coffee connect sessions where we were highlighting the different NCD alliances. We had a couple of lunch sessions where we highlighted World Diabetes Day. That was on the 14th of November, and we discussed big ideas around diabetes. And we also had a lunch session hosted by the NCD Alliance's Supporters Consultation Group, speaking to the power of partnerships. We had one session specifically on the theme of advocacy planning and also discussing the relationship between the NCD Alliance and regional and national NCD alliances. Next slide, please. So a little bit more on the program, and I think here it would be important to say that the NCD Alliance will be circulating in January. We are currently compiling a report of the forum, and this will be circulated with all delegates and the different contacts of the NCD Alliance. And here you'll be able to read more detail on what was discussed in all of the different sessions. But just to give you a little flavor here for those that weren't able to attend, and to remind those that were able to attend. So basically the first session, we had a keynote speech given by Professor Srinath Reddy of the Public Health Foundation Institute in India, speaking to the global NCD response, so really kind of creating a common knowledge base amongst all forum delegates. So hearing about what global commitments have been made, what are these global policies and frameworks that are now in place, and specifically we heard from Professor Reddy about what happened in New York in September and the implications and opportunities of having NCDs included in the UN Agenda 2030. And this was again, kind of continued in the panel discussions that ensued. And here in this specific panel, we actually heard from a member of the IDF Young Leaders Program. We heard from Crystal from Barbados, speaking about how that youth voice can add to the global NCD response. We also heard from Dr. Bente Nicholson of the WHO, head of the Secretariat of the Global Coordination Mechanism. So we heard more from her about what architecture is in place and what does the global NCD response currently look like. The workshops in Stream 1 further delved into this, and the first, so these were concurrent workshops, and so delegates had to choose which ones they wanted to attend, and one here was organized by the WHO and the UN Development Program on integrating NCDs into national development plans and frameworks, and this was the workshop that was most favorited by delegates that attended the forum, and I think it was it provided a lot of very rich information on what exactly is the process and opportunities for points of entry for civil society organizations. And we heard of NCD case studies and also from tobacco, the tobacco movement, some examples there. These workshop the workshop sessions here also delved into prioritizing prevention in national NCD responses, and in this case here we actually brought leaders of the different global organizations focused on each of the four common risk factors of NCDs, talking about what are some kind of opportunities for cross-collaboration and lessons learned. This workshop stream also delved into the other end of the NCD continuum, looking at universal health coverage for NCDs, and finally we also looked at advancing effective multi-sectoral action for NCDs, a theme that was very much threaded throughout the whole of the forum. Next slide, please. For the second plenary session, the forum looked at what is the NCD movement? What does this movement actually look like? We know that it's a relatively new movement, but we were able to hear from Katie Dain, the Executive Director of the NCD Alliance, about an exercise that the NCD Alliance conducted and launched at the forum, Civil Society Situational Analysis, which really kind of, we'll talk about in a second, but basically an exercise where a research piece of what NCD civil society looks like at the moment. Who are we, and what are we doing, and what are some of the successes and challenges being faced? This particular plenary really kind of brought in some. We wanted to hear a little bit about what were some initiatives happening at the regional level. We had Professor Gerald Yonga talking about the East African City Alliance initiative. We had Veronica Shaw of Argentina talking about the efforts in Argentina, but particularly also from a regional level. We heard from CLAS, the Healthy Latin America Coalition. And we heard, importantly, here from the HIV movement. We had Jennifer Bushy from the Global Network of People Living with HIV telling us a little bit about what are some lessons learned in her experience and in that specific, recognized best practice in health movement. So from the HIV movement, what the NCD movement could learn. So the workshop sessions here really kind of delved more into this, and these workshop sessions were really focused on the working and the mechanics of effective NCD alliances. So we delved into the governance issues and what are some best practices in organizing as an alliance. So this was a session led by the South African NCD Alliance, the UK Richmond Group of Charities, and the European Chronic Disease Alliance. And it's important to note that with all of the workshop sessions, we really insisted on having a very significant chunk of the workshop session dedicated to an interactive element, as well as really showcasing best practices and examples from regional and national NCD alliances. We had one workshop here. This was very well received on resource mobilization. And I think the thing that was interesting in this workshop and that many delegates commented on as they favorited it was that this workshop delved into, obviously, the notion of mobilizing financial resources, but really delved into what are some non-financial resources that can be leveraged, and this really resonated with delegates. We had a workshop on campaign planning organized by the American Cancer Society and Mexico Saludable, so really sharing a very concrete tool for advocacy planning that can support NCD alliances. And finally, we heard more about this concept of collaborating and what structured collaboration might look like, and we heard about twinning and the example of kind of north-south and south-south cooperation. This really kind of delved into the Danish NCD Alliance and their relationship with the East African NCD Alliance initiative there. Next slide, please. So the keynote speech given by Katie Dain, as I said, was served to launch the civil society situational analysis that was conducted by the NCD Alliance. And this is a report that is available online, and you have the web address there in the slides that will be shared. And this is a really, I would say, really essential reading for anyone that is involved in the NCD movement, and it's that snapshot of what does this movement look like, who are the different regional and national NCD alliances, and here I should note that 29 NCD alliances were involved in this research, and as I say, this is a very exciting movement that is being born and growing rapidly. We had 45 alliances attend the forum, and at the forum itself we had expressions of intent and commitment towards starting new alliances. So these are rapidly forming, and of course this exercise is something that will be repeated on a regular basis. But basically this research piece here really informs the strategic plan for the next 5 years for the NCD Alliance going forward, and really also informs the development of the program of the Global NCD Alliance Forum. And it was based on a survey, interviews, and reports of the regional meetings that were conducted in the lead up to the forum. Next slide, please. And so, without wanting to take too much time here, but basically the the situation analysis goes into many different aspects of the alliances, and the first one is what do they look like, and you can read the report to actually see what the membership looks like and what type of organizations are being involved. And just to note this one point here, that on the governance we found that there's no one size fits all. Every alliance is unique. Over 2/3 of the respondents were from informal alliances. We found that alliances from high-income countries were more likely to be informal, and when looking at lower middle-income countries, this varies, and probably it varies by regions. For instance, we saw that in the African region there was more of a need for formalizing and for having legal status, whereas in Latin America we spoke to many alliances that told us that purposefully they wanted horizontal structures that allowed for fluidity and flexibility, and for having for really encouraging ownership of the members of the different members of the alliance itself, and having less of a top-down approach. And so we can see there that, of course, there's these how these you can read in the report what the formal alliances look like, what the informal alliances look like. These loose networks, commonly bound by a memorandum of understanding in some cases, and we also heard about what the secretariats look like. These are often in-kind contributions of different members of the alliance. Sometimes, in some cases, they are rotating. In other cases, they're actually resourced with the resources being contributed by one of the members. Next slide, please. With regards to what the alliances are working on, I think one thing that was really very that was wonderful for us to discover was that this analysis revealed that NCD alliances really have an advocacy focus. And they bring a very vast and diverse group of organizations together. But one thing seems to ring true, which is that these organizations come together with a very clear advocacy purpose, and with the notion that together they are stronger. Some of the priority issues that organizations are advocating on are prevention, for instance, national NCD plans, multi-sectoral action on NCDs. We noticed that there was a little bit of a trend perhaps being observed, for instance, that in higher income settings there is an attention, a focus on prevention, whereas access to treatment type of advocacy focused on this particular issue here is something more common in lower income settings, and this to us is something that makes sense if you consider the fragile nature of health systems in lower income settings. So this is access to treatment might be a gap that is felt stronger in those settings. Next slide, please. So in the situational analysis report, you can read much more about, I think one thing that is really interesting that was certainly explored at the forum is what have been some of the successes and what are some of the best practices that are that exist out there. But one final thing just to highlight here is that we looked at the capacity needs of the snapshot of alliances, and this really fed into the forum, and we heard about the need for support for resource mobilization, campaign planning, really wanting to hear about this exchange and best practice and advocacy, like what are others doing that could help inform your own work, as well as, governance issues and running effective alliances and so on. Next slide, please. So just to finish the civil society situation analysis there, I recommend that you read the report, and what you will notice as well is that there's a series of recommendations made in this report, recommendations made to the NCD alliances themselves, so some best practices or some elements that were really boiled down from all this different data that was collected that make for good recommendations for the movement overall, the civil society movement overall, as well as recommendations for the NCD Alliance itself, as well as recommendations for multilaterals, bilaterals, and governments, and for basically other stakeholders wanting to actively engage with this civil society community. Moving back to the forum here, we finally went into this session on accountability and what does accountability really mean. And I think here having Sir George Elaine give the keynote speech was was wonderful, as I think that he was able to really kind of drill down on what is meant by accountability, who needs to be made accountable to whom. And this was something that was further explored in the panel. We heard from the Healthy Caribbean Coalition, for instance, about what they've been doing with regional civil society status report, a methodology that has been provided by the NCD Alliance. This concept of a status report as a way of encouraging NCD accountability in NCDs. We heard from Doug Webb from the UNDP on good governance being important for accountability. We also heard from the Southeast Asia Tobacco Control Alliance, and of course, with tobacco advocates really kind of sharing what some of their tools and methods have been and successes in keeping governments and other stakeholders accountable. So the workshop sessions here really kind of delved into the concept of accountability, of course. The first one was on official monitoring of NCDs and hearing from the WHO what those processes are, as well as hearing about civil society engagement. And the NCD Alliance here was able to share its methodology and how that's being used in different geographies. We had one session that had some very interesting discussion about monitoring of the private sector. And we heard from the Healthy Latin America Coalition, the Southeast Asia Tobacco Alliance again, and the World Cancer Research Fund International on some of their experiences in the nutrition space. And then finally, we heard about the importance of actually mobilizing the public in advocacy efforts to actually mobilize public opinion to drive change, and some very kind of concrete practices shared here on package labeling and efforts in the Philippines, for instance, and actually hearing from Mexico and their soda tax campaign what they've done. And then finally, one workshop there was as well as communications workshop. This final workshop was also very well received and very favorited by advocates. We heard about the power and best practices and successes around engaging people affected by NCDs in the NCD response, and many delegates said that several delegates said that this should be actually brought up to the plenary level instead of just keeping it at the workshop level. So again, hearing about the importance of those voices in this movement. Next slide, please. And so this we will be sharing with you the evaluation results of the forum. 95% of delegates rated their experience from very good to outstanding. And this rather complex this graph here, basically what it shows us is that the highlights of the forum for the delegates were the networking component, as well as the interactivity of the workshop sessions and being able to hear from world-renowned experts in the plenary sessions. Next, please. What the forum was able to produce, I think, was a very I'm not sure if revitalization is the word, but basically a real bringing together this community and really kind of feeling the excitement of the community and meeting its peers. And as a result, we saw a Sharjah declaration on NCDs was produced, and this was something that we wanted to make sure was very inclusive of civil society. So this was something that civil society representatives of national and regional NCD alliances were consulted on. There was a regionally representative editorial committee that worked on producing this declaration. I encourage you to read it, and we have the link here. But basically, it talks about this notion of accountability. I think one thing that the forum was very good in doing was actually that we tend to talk about accountability of decision makers, and this was certainly a focus of the forum. But delegates felt very strongly this idea of also the accountability of civil society itself. So we've heard so much of global policy advances in NCDs. Here, the Sharjah Declaration is really a very strong commitment of civil society being done on a global stage that now has to be taken at regional and national level. But it talks about these commitments on working together, about driving advocacy and encouraging accountability and monitoring progress. And it's really an advocacy tool. So I encourage all to really read this and to take it on as well. So using it as an advocacy tool with these recommendations for governments, for the UN and other multilateral organizations, as well as the business community and the media as well. Next, please. As well as the Sharjah Declaration on NCDs, the Forum produced a Sharjah Youth Statement that very organically emerged from the group, from the youth advocates present at the Forum. So a statement of support for the Sharjah Declaration and really highlighting the need and the value of the youth voice in the NCD advocacy movement. Several NCD alliances emerged, and expressions of intent emerged at the Forum itself. So there's a really strong commitment to working together and seeing the worth in working as an alliance to forward these common aims. And finally, we also saw the Forum really kind of impacting on the confidence levels of the delegates and advocates in attendance. So we basically hear that the delegates felt much more confident in areas such as ensuring accountability on NCDs and forming national and regional alliances and partnering with others, NCD advocacy, etc. Next, please. And so what we are hearing is really this excitement in creating new connections and wanting to continue this beyond the Forum. So either establishing a national NCD alliance or working with the regional alliance or engaging youth and people affected by NCDs or taking forward these concepts of accountability, of making decision makers accountable, but also how NCD alliances need to be kind of transparent and accountable to stakeholders themselves. Next, please. And then finally, just the next steps on the Forum. One thing that was absolutely wonderful was that the patron of the Forum, Her Highness, in the closing ceremony of the Forum, was able to announce that she would like to continue supporting the Forum, and so announced that there will be another global NCD Alliance Forum in 2017 in Sharjah. So we are delighted to be able to say that this will be a regular, that the Forum is going to be a regular event, and that another one will follow in 2017. So next steps for the Forum, as well as having another point of bringing the community together, will be that the NCD Alliance will be following up on the Sharjah Declaration. So how this now gets really embedded in what is happening advocacy-wise in the different regions and countries, exploring more this relationship between the global NCD Alliance and the regional, national levels, and finally really taking all of the results of the Forum, as well as civil society situational analysis, and putting together an NCD Alliance capacity building strategy. So the NCD Alliance is taking very, very seriously this issue of supporting and nurturing the birth and the growth of the NCD civil society movement overall. And I think just I would like to finish here. This African proverb that was mentioned at the Forum was, I heard it repeated many times by many different delegates. It was something that really resonated with everyone. If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Cristina, for that really comprehensive overview of the Forum. And just to really reinforce that it was really, really an important event for the NCD Alliance. As Cristina said, it was the first time that we had convened that network of national and regional alliances, so a huge amount of learning and networking and connections made across civil society. But also it did really reflect a shift in the NCD Alliance's own strategic plan, with an increased focus on supporting national and regional action through capacity building. So just to really reinforce those 2 points. Before we move on to the next agenda item, we've had a question from Craig at Lily. Craig asks, knowing that there were lots of recommendations and specific country enthusiasm discussed at the Global Entity Alliance Forum, Cristina, what are the plans for in-country follow-up on initiatives coming out of the Forum, and how do you suggest we as members of the Entity Alliance coordinate any help we can offer?
Thanks, Priya. That's a good question. I think this really kind of ties in with this the capacity building strategy that the NCD Alliance is going to be putting together starting in January, and we really want to I think the forum itself is it's wonderful that there was that safe space for the community to convene, but we all realize that, we've been at many meetings that we don't want it just to be a meeting. This is really the beginning of a much bigger collaboration and network building. So we want to actually kind of follow up on those in-country initiatives, and really the NCD Alliance is going to be discussing what are platforms that the NCD Alliance can provide to encourage advocates in country to share their best practices. Are they building new alliances, and also what advocacy efforts are they doing? So we really encourage people on this call, and we will be reaching out to forum delegates to actively share this with us, with the NCD Alliance, thinking like how we can package this to really kind of condense the best practices that we are seeing emerging. So we would like people to reach out actively to us, and the NCD Alliance will also be thinking about, what are platforms that can really encourage and structure that networking better.
Great, thanks, Cristina. And just to finish by also really encouraging, as Cristina said, everybody to read the situational analysis report of national and regional alliances that we published and launched at the forum, because it does really provide a great wealth of information on both, who and what the alliances are and what they're doing, but also their priorities, their achievements, and their capacity needs. So it's really going to be informing a lot of the NCD Alliance's work going forward at the global and national level as well. Okay, fantastic. So let's move on to our second agenda item, which is an update on our global development campaign, which is split into two parts. Firstly, we have Priya Kanayson, who is going to be providing an update on where we are in the indicator process for the Sustainable Development Goals. Priya.
Thanks very much, Katie. So I will be giving a very brief update on the development process of the global set of indicators for the SDGs and the post-2015 agenda. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the process thus far, the IAEG, so the Interagency Expert Group on SDGs, met for the second time in Bangkok in October to discuss the initial proposed set of global indicators. So as a result of that meeting, 159 proposed indicators were classified as green, which meant that there was general agreement or minimal modifications proposed, and the remaining indicators in that proposed framework were classified as gray, meaning that more work and in-depth discussions was required. So immediately following the expert group meeting in October, an open consultation on the 159 green indicators was held from the 4th through the 7th of November, and you can view the results of that consultation by going to the link there. And the NCD Alliance responded to the consultation and submitted comments on indicators for targets 3.2 on nutrition, 3.4 on NCDs, 3.5 on harmful use of alcohol, 3.6 on road injuries, 3A on implementation of the FCTC, 3B on access to essential medicines and TRIPS, and 7.1 on pollution. And so that consultation concluded in early November, and the results of that, as I said, are online. And just yesterday, a consultation on the gray indicators, so those that required more work, concluded, to which NCD also submitted comments on indicators for targets 3.8 on universal health coverage and 3.9 on air pollution. So at the bottom of the page there in the box, there's some important links that will take you to the general website of the IAEG, the proposed work plan, as well as the updated list of priority indicators, which is the basis for the consultations for both the those indicators marked as green and the ones marked as gray. Next slide, please. So also as a result of the October meeting, there was an updated proposed timeline, and this is just to give you an idea of where we are now. So from the beginning of December through February, the IAEG will be continuing their work on gray indicators, which includes continued discussion on data disaggregation, which I'll come back to in a moment. The group is currently working on finalizing their report to the UN Statistical Commission, which takes into account relevant points from the recent climate change agreement in Paris, which Jess will go over shortly, as well as the results of the open consultations on both the green and gray indicators. In mid-January, there's to be a meeting of the high-level group of the Statistical Commission in which the co-chairs of the IAEG will participate and provide an update on the process thus far. All of this is leading to March of 2016, where the IAEG will meet for a third time before submitting their final proposed global indicator framework to the Statistical Commission for consideration at their meeting in March, and that again is March of 2016. Next slide, please. So perhaps the biggest change for the NCD community came in the form of changes to the proposed indicators for Target 3.4, again the NCD target in the SDGs. Prior to the October meeting in Bangkok, the indicator read, as you can see there, the probability of dying of CVD, cancer, diabetes, or chronic respiratory diseases between the ages of 30 and 70. In the latest version of the proposal, dated November 2nd, again after the IAEG meeting, the age range of 30 to 70 has been dropped for the indicator for 3.41, and a second indicator to measure mental health has been added in the form of suicide mortality rate. So the addition of the second indicator is a great success, as NCD Alliance and the NCD community have strongly advocated for a separate indicator for mental health, and we submitted this proposal in prior consultation, so it's really good to see that the IAEG has taken that up. So the IAEG will pick up the discussion on the age range, on its inclusion or continued elimination of the age range of 30 to 70 during their work on data disaggregation, which is currently underway, and as I mentioned before, going through middle of February. Next slide. So as you can see from this slide, our involvement in the global indicator process development has been ongoing since January. And this is really just to give you an overview of the process thus far from the NCD Alliance and our involvement. In January, we conducted our initial network consultation. We moved into August, which was then a consultation based on the proposed indicators provided by the IAEG, and we submitted a collective response. In November was the consultation on indicators marked green, and we submitted a response on the 9 relevant indicators. And most recently in December, which again concluded yesterday, the consultation on indicators marked as gray. So moving forward, we'll obviously continue to follow this process and participate in any future open consultations as they arise. So this process, I really urge everyone to keep track of what's going on the website, as all of this is coming quite rapidly. Next slide. So next steps, as I said, follow the indicator process, and you can link to the website there. And also a really good tool to utilize the Sustainable Development Knowledge Platform, which serves as a hub for information about the process moving forward on implementation of the agenda, monitoring of the agenda, which is in the form of a high-level political forum, which will take place in July of next year, and also development of the technology facilitation mechanism, as well as information about stakeholder engagement. So next slide, please. Well, any questions?
Great, thanks, Priya. We'll come back to questions once Jess has done hers on climate change. So I see one from Ivona, but we'll come back to that in a minute. So thank you, Priya. Over to Jess now, who will give us an update on the recent COP21 conference in Paris. Jess.
Hi, everyone. So just to start off, some quick background to COP21 for those that are less familiar with it. So it's the 21st Conference of Parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and there are now 195 member states party to that convention. So they were there together with civil society, private sector, and academia, all the usual suspects. And it was in Paris from the 30th of November to the 12th of December. It was initially due to finish on the 11th of December, but the agreement was actually adopted on the evening of the 12th. And the purpose of the meeting was to review implementation of the UNFCCC, and the aspect that sets us apart from previous COPs is to reach an international agreement on climate change in order to limit average global temperature increases to below 2 degrees above what's called pre-industrial levels, so the temperatures that were observed globally on average before the Industrial Revolution. And this was a big ask and long awaited. Previously in Copenhagen at the Climate Summit in 2009, there had been efforts to get to a similar agreement, but instead we came out with the Copenhagen Accord, which was signed by just 5 countries, the US, Brazil, South Africa, India and China. rather than a global agreement. And this was due to numerous factors that had to be worked through in order to reach the agreement this time. And the text for the Paris Agreement was actually drafted in Lima last year and then debated throughout this COP. And at the bottom of the page there, you've got two websites of COP21, one by the host country, France, and then the official UNFCCC one. So just to introduce the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change itself, something that I learned recently, which is actually extremely relevant to health advocacy going forward, is that according to the definition of the adverse effects of climate change in the Convention, health is effectively 1/3 of the adverse effects of climate change, which can be divided into environmental effects, socio-economic effects, and health effects. And you've got the text from the Convention itself there, and you can read the full Convention if you follow the link at the bottom of the page. And health has been sidelined for too long in the climate negotiations and debates, and this was really a key year for health because the health community was out in force. And now a recap of the links between climate and NCDs. Nick Watts from the Global Climate and Health Alliance actually gave an update on our last webinar, but for those who are unable to join, I'll just run through them quickly now. So climate change and NCDs are two of the defining challenges of the 21st century as defined by well-known people like Margaret Chan and Helen Clark. Air pollution actually causes 7 million deaths annually. This is the cumulative effect of both indoor air pollution from cook stoves and also the better-known outdoor air pollution. And these two issues are obviously major challenges, but addressing them actually poses a major opportunity in terms of co-benefits, so interventions for one challenge are often beneficial for the other. And it's this reframing that's really been the main effort of the health community in gathering consensus and support for addressing these two issues in tandem. So how to address climate and NCDs in tandem? The key intervention being to reduce emissions, and there are obviously many ways to do this linked to energy production, transport, building design, agriculture and waste, but energy production is really key here, and fossil fuels are notoriously dangerous for human health. For example, coal actually causes 1,000 times more mortality kilowatt hour per kilowatt hour than wind energy, so transition to renewable energy has great benefits for both climate change and health. In terms of active transport, walking and cycling, obviously that increases physical activity and decreases air pollution. Physical activity, as you all know, is one of the leading NCD risk factors and causes 3.2 million deaths annually. And ways to improve physical activity include pedestrianised areas, cycle paths, cycle schemes. And there's an interesting reinforcing effect there in that, of course, as the outdoor becomes less polluted, it's more appealing to exercise, so it's positive reinforcement there. And all of these changes can be implemented as part of sustainable urbanisation. I've missed out sustainable food systems. And as part of this, some of the key factors we're looking at are reducing red meat and quantities of processed food. And we're seeing increasing amounts of red meat and processed food being consumed in modern diets. And this can lead to hypertension, high blood glucose and high cholesterol, some of the principal effects. And these are 3 of the 6 leading causes of deaths globally. So we're advocating for a move towards locally sourced plant-based diets. And these interventions that I just discussed cannot be implemented as part of sustainable urbanisation. And this is really important because urbanisation, obviously has plenty of negative effects, but urban areas do provide geographical areas of particular opportunity in terms of the high population concentrations that can be reached in a limited focused target area, so it's quite controlled, and also these urban areas are a nexus of influence with activities that can be redesigned or reoriented for the benefit of both climate change and health. And there are many other health impacts beyond NCDs. Obviously we focused on NCDs here, but also malaria, diarrhea and dengue are highly sensitive to temperature changes. And the NCD Alliance will soon be releasing a brief out in early January, joint with the Global Climate and Health Alliance on climate change and NCD, so do look out for that. Moving on to the Paris Agreement itself, the main outcomes, it was an unprecedented success. So the aim going in was to hold the increase in the global average temperature increases to 2 degrees, and actually the final document suggests that countries will be adhering to cutting their emissions to ensure that temperature rises are actually well below 2 degrees Celsius and preferably no higher than 1.5 degrees Celsius. And this extra half a degree will have significant benefits for both human and planetary health. Second, every 5 years, countries' commitments to reducing their emissions will be reviewed beginning in 2018. So this will be every 5 years, but there was a lot of discussion around this, presumably with countries not wanting to be followed or held too closely to account. But they will be being pushed to achieve their commitments in emission reductions. And finally, developed countries will be providing a floor, so a starting minimum amount of $100 billion to developing countries to adapt to climate change and to switch to renewable energy. And this will be expected to increase in future years, and the initial hope was for more, despite this already being a significant amount. And you can read the full Paris Agreement at the link at the bottom of the page. In terms of health being present in the Paris Agreement, it's included very early on in the agreement in the preamble with an emphasis on right to health, which is brilliant, and also in the section on short-term actions that will be taking place between 2016 and 2020. In terms of what happens next, remaining countries do need to submit their national commitments. These are called INDCs as soon as possible. These were supposed to be in the first quarter of 2015, but actually only 160 countries have submitted their INDCs to date. And from this point, progress can be accelerated. We're encouraging communication and collaboration between the environment and health sectors and beyond, especially at the national level, and for inclusion of health language in climate policies. And obviously we also need an all-of-society approach as well as an all-of-government one, so that one which involves civil society, private sector, academia, and also changes at the community level. As is the case with NCDs, everyone is responsible for climate change, and there won't be progress unless all are on board. We need to promote health-sensitive monitoring and evaluation of current national climate policies, and civil society obviously has a key role in accountability in this regard. And we will be advocating for increased climate financing for the benefit of human and planetary health. And the link at the very bottom of that page, you can view the INDC for your country, should that be of interest, or to see if it has been submitted yet. Thanks very much indeed.
Excellent. Thanks, Jess, for that really good overview of COP21 and how it links to health and NCDs. Let's go to Q&A for both of those presentations, so both on the indicators for the Sustainable Development Goals and then also for COP21. We've got a couple of questions here. One question from Ivona at FCA to Priya. Who and what is the high-level group that's meeting in mid-January within the IAEG process that you presented on, and do we know who the members of that group are?
Thanks, Katie. So the group consists of approximately 15 to 20 representatives of national statistical offices with a balanced geographical representation. So it's not all northern countries, and which follows the distribution in the IAEG SDG group more broadly. So the list of members is online, and we can link to that afterwards. So that's the group that will be meeting in mid-January.
Okay, great, thanks. And we've got another question around the indicator on alcohol. Can you, Priya, provide us a bit more information regarding the NCD Alliance's contribution to the harmful use of alcohol indicator?
Sure. So from the beginning, we have advocated for alignment with the global monitoring framework and the indicator that's present there and that member states have signed up to. The indicator that is currently in the proposed global framework is harmful use of alcohol, defined according to the national context as alcohol per capita consumption within a calendar year in liters of pure alcohol. And that is in alignment with the indicator contained in the global monitoring framework for NCDs and is universally measurable for all countries. So that's something that we very much support.
Great, thank you, Priya. A quick question to Jess on COP21. You were talking about the kind of national contribution that countries are currently contributing to, including the INDCs. How much of those do they go into detail around health and NCDs? What can we expect from the NCD community perspective?
So there is a great deal of variation in the INDCs, both in terms of their length and their content. And I really would suggest looking at the INDC for your specific country, and if health and NCDs aren't included, then to really carry out some targeted advocacy to your government on integrating health and NCDs into policy language. And if it is included, then using this as a ground to build on for future work.
Fantastic. And I assume that from an NCD perspective, we would be using the national NCD plans as the kind of foundation for what we're trying to integrate into the INDCs.
Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thanks very much, Priya and Jess, for those presentations. I'm conscious of time, so we're going to speed up onto our next agenda item. As I said earlier, we're very pleased to have a guest speaker with us today from PATH, which is Bonnie Keith, who works in the NCD team at PATH. Bonnie, over to you to provide an overview of the No Empty Shelves project, diabetes supplies there when needed.
Thank you so much, Katie. Hi, everyone. My name is Bonnie Keith, as Katie mentioned. And actually, just a quick question for Katie and Jess. I know we are coming close to the end of the meeting, so I just wanted to check with you. Is 15 minutes still feasible, or should I try and shorten it a little bit?
No, absolutely. Keep going 15 minutes. That's fine.
All right. Thank you. So as Katie mentioned, I work with PATH in our non-communicable disease program, and I have been working as the Deputy Director / Project Manager for a project that we are currently implementing in partnership with Novo Nordisk called No Empty Shelves, Diabetes Supplies There When Needed. And recently we have been doing a lot of work. You may have seen a lot of publicity around a report that we published in September, as well as our recent call to action. So what I'd like to do today is just go over the project and present some information from the report as well as the call to action, and then take any questions that you may have, and we'll go from there. So the slide that you have in front of you is the objectives of our project. So really the main role we're trying to fill here is really building the evidence base around the availability of affordable essential medicines and technologies for diabetes, which we are using as a indicator of the availability of affordable essential medicines and technologies for non-communicable diseases overall. We're aiming to raise awareness of the barriers that affect availability of these products, and then also ending our project trying to build a network of the key stakeholders in both the NCD, global health, supply chain, and other communities that impact availability of public health commodities within low and middle income countries. And let's see. I was going to move the slides myself, but actually, Jess or someone, if you wouldn't mind helping me do this since I'm in the room alone, that would be helpful. But you can actually go back to the previous one. There we go. Thank you. So this slide just shows you our technical advisory committee members. As you'll see, Katie is actually one of our advisory committee members. So we have a solid representation of individuals from both the clinical diabetes community, the diabetes program management community, public health, supply chain, academia, et cetera, that are supporting this project and providing us with technical assistance. Next slide. And these are the global targets that we are really aiming to assess availability against these global targets. As Cristina mentioned earlier, we've got the recent Sustainable Development Goal that's focusing on reducing premature mortality from NCDs by 1/3. But we also have a Sustainable Development Goal around ensuring access to affordable, quality-assured medicines. And then more specific to NCDs, we also have achieving 80% availability of the basic products needed to treat and diagnose NCDs in both public and private facilities. Next slide. So as there is no global list of the essential medicines and technologies needed to comprehensively diagnose and treat diabetes, PATH created one that you see here. This list is based on the WHO Essential Medicines list as well as the PEN package, and also on clinical practice guidelines and input from our technical advisory committee. So these 22 products include those that are needed to monitor and treat hyperglycemia, as well as the products needed for hypertension and hyperlipidemia. So it's a fairly comprehensive list of 22 commodities. Next slide. And our key outputs for the project, which initiated in July of 2014, are development of a global landscape report, 2 country assessments in Kenya and Senegal, and then a global call to action. And next slide. So our landscape report, which I mentioned, is called Diabetes Supplies, Are They There When Needed? You can access the report at the website that you see on the slide there. And on the page where the report is present, you can download the full report, an executive summary, and also a project fact sheet. And this report was developed in consultation with a number of key stakeholders. We interviewed 28 stakeholders in various fields. And also conducted a very extensive literature review to provide the information needed for the report. Our primary sources of data on availability of diabetes medicines and technologies were the RAPIA reports, the Rapid Assessment Protocol for Insulin Access, also the surveys conducted by the World Health Organization and Health Action International, and finally, the WHO Service Availability and Readiness Assessment. We also used a few other sources of information, but these are the primary data sources. Next slide. So, what did we find out with the report? What you see here is a summary of our key findings, and this is based on the sources available, as I mentioned, but I should note that there is generally a paucity of data on the full range of products that I described earlier. We see information for a very small subset of those products, I would say in the range of between 5 and 10. So the information we have found is indicative of the current environment around availability, but it certainly is not comprehensive. So as you see here, general availability truly is insufficient to meet the needs of people living with diabetes, and that is both the people that are currently living with the disease, but also people that are predicted to be diagnosed with diabetes in the future. And even facilities offering diabetes diagnosis and treatment have limited availability of these supplies, and this is according to the Service Availability and Readiness Assessment. In fact, median availability in these facilities ranged from a low of 20.5% for insulin to 59.5% for urine protein test strips. And that's across all countries and both the public and private sectors. So even for the most available product of those assessed, you see it at 60%, which is far below the WHO Global Action Plan target of 80%. Next slide. And that is actually indicated on this slide, which is, you can see the red line, which shows you where the gap target is, and then a series of products that are assessed in the Service Availability and Readiness Assessments. And this slide shows you the availability of these products in all facilities compared to availability of these products in those facilities providing diabetes services. You will see that the products are more available in those facilities providing diabetes services, which is fantastic. However, you also will see that even though they are more available, they are still insufficiently available. And of the products that are available, it's interesting that the multi-indication products such as weigh scales and blood pressure apparatus are the most available products, and as opposed to products that are specific to diabetes treatment. Next slide. We also looked at affordability, and again, there was extremely limited data on this particular indicator. So what we found is that diabetes medicines are generally unaffordable based on what we know, and that markups occur very significantly between the actual procurement price and then the retail price that consumers pay. And this is in the public sector because, of course, we were not able to really assess the procurement and retail prices for the private sector based on the literature that's out there right now. And there's really a widespread discrepancy across countries, but that's across countries and also within countries. For instance, combination treatment of the lowest priced generic version of glibenclamide and metformin as a package ranged from 1 day's wages in Fiji to 8 days' wages in Ghana. And affordable in the context of these surveys is considered to be less than 1 day's wages for a 30-day supply. So you can see there's a fairly extensive range. In fact, another study found that across 6 countries, a 30-day supply of insulin cost between 2.8 days' wages in Brazil to as much as 19.6 days wages in Malawi. So it's a really broad range, but in that case, insulin was unaffordable in all the countries assessed. Next slide, please. So this is just a summary slide to describe the factors that affect availability of diabetes products, and these factors all feed into one another. For instance, financing, we saw that there is really limited or unreliable funding for procurement of diabetes products. On the health system side, there's limited capacity to address diabetes and other NCDs. Preventative care and treatment for NCDs is not available at the primary care level, and a comprehensive approach to treat NCDs is needed in order to move management of these diseases more through the health systems and make them better able to adapt and address non-communicable diseases. Regulatory issues are also a concern. Many countries have poor regulatory capacity in general, and then the addition of non-communicable diseases also often is a burden for their regulatory agencies. There are limited quality assurance practices for non-communicable disease products, and then non-existent or limited regulatory collaboration and harmonization across countries. When you look at national essential medicines lists, we saw that many were often out of date or were not harmonized with the WHO model list of essential medicines. In some countries, we see irrational selection of products, meaning that the public sector is deciding to procure products that are not on the WHO medicines list and therefore may cost them more and may be they may be more of a quote-unquote luxury product than is necessary. And in some cases, we also see that there is exclusion of essential technologies from procurement packages. Finally, the supply chain is really a key factor that inhibits availability of diabetes products. We saw that there is really insufficient or poor quality surveillance data used to forecast and plan the supply of these products. Often, public sector procurement is not based on the essential medicines list, and we also see that procurement in general is somewhat inefficient. There are also some issues with costs that seem basic but are actually really important, including the issue of value-added tax and customs duties that are placed on these products. If those were eliminated, it would go a long way to reducing the end-use costs on them. And then finally, local distribution challenges, which we see for many products and not just those for diabetes and NCDs. Next slide. So we are, as I mentioned, there is a paucity of data, and there just is not a lot of information out there on the full range of the products that we are really hoping to assess. So what PATH is doing is undertaking a supply chain assessment and a pricing and availability survey in both Kenya and Senegal. And these surveys were based on the RAPIA as well as the World Health Organization and Health Action International survey methodology. We looked at 3 regions in each country for the supply chain assessment and 5 regions in each country for the pricing and availability survey. And we are really trying to get at what is the situation on the ground for the full range of these products. And by comparing Kenya and Senegal, we're looking at a centralized system in Senegal to a decentralized system in Kenya. Those assessments have been completed in both countries, and we are now underway with data analysis. We anticipate conducting dissemination meetings in both countries in February, and we'll be publishing a manuscript on this early in 2016. So I will be happy to come back and talk to you in another webinar in the future about the findings from our research that was actually conducted on the ground. Next slide. So what we also assessed for the landscape report was how other sectors really have reacted to the issue of supply security. As many of you are well aware, vertical programming really has driven some of the efforts towards achieving supply security for various health sectors, including HIV, family planning, malaria, tuberculosis, etc. And while there's been some debate over the structure of some large global partnerships, in general, we see that partnerships are really critical. Partnerships and networks really are driving the advancement of supply security in other health sectors. They have benefited greatly from coordination and alignment amongst the members of those partnerships and networks, and from the momentum and advocacy that is created by their establishment. This includes networks such as the Reproductive Health Supplies Coalition, which is a global partnership of over 300 members that is really striving to achieve security of commodities for family planning and maternal health. Similarly, the Stop TB partnership is a broad partnership of about 1,100 members that is aiming to ensure access to effective diagnosis, treatment, and a cure for tuberculosis. Additional activities that really help to cement supply security and move it forward in other health sectors include, obviously, development assistance, which has facilitated partnership development and also, in some cases, the actual procurement of products, taking that burden off of countries. For NCDs, that is not necessarily feasible nor desirable, so we will need to be determining ways to get around that particular facilitating factor and figure out what is the best way for the NCD community to move supply security forward in the face of limited development assistance. Again, pool procurement mechanisms was brought up many times as an opportunity. We see this with a global fund, for instance, where countries and other procurers can procure products at much lower cost due to the high volume of procurement. And finally, country engagement, which of course is really the key for NCDs. Next slide, please. So what are we doing at PATH to try to move this forward in addition to building the evidence base? We recently put out a call to action, which was officially launched this past Saturday on December 12th, which was in support of Universal Health Coverage Day. We also conducted a soft launch during the World Diabetes Congress at the start of this month. This call to action is really aimed at driving our partners to step forward and recognize the important role that supplies play in improving the lives of people affected by diabetes and other NCDs. So we are calling on our partners, our colleagues, and all of you on the call today to take action and sign the call to action, as well as share your support on social media using the hashtag that you see there. Since we launched the report this month, we've seen a really vibrant social media following, for one, which is great. With the hashtag, we've had that tweeted just under 300 times, and so far it's reached about 687,000 users. So it's receiving really widespread support, including support from the NCD Alliance and many of its members. If we can go to the next slide. And this slide will show you, these are just some of our institutions that are supporting the call to date. So at the soft launch at the beginning of the month, we had about 20 signatories. As of today, we have over 90, and just over half of those signatories are institutional. So we do have a number of individuals signing on without their institutional backing, which is also really great. We hope that you will join us in convincing our colleagues in global health that essential medicines and technologies for NCDs are just that, essential. And I am going to put the links to the call to action sign-on page here in the chat box. And I hope that everybody can click on that and access it. There it goes. And so we really hope that you all can help us take action on this key issue and move this forward. As we move forward into 2016, we are aiming to convene a meeting amongst the global partners that are in support of this effort. And we're determining exactly what that's going to look like, but we do hope that will happen by the middle of next year to really kickstart this effort with people meeting in person to start talking about it and determining ways of moving forward. And next slide. So this is just the last slide to say thank you, and I am happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Excellent. Thank you, Bonnie. We don't seem to have any questions at the moment in the chat box. I've got one myself. So obviously the country assessments have taken place in Kenya and Senegal. Are there any plans to do any further country assessments next year in other regions, for example?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we are consulting with our partner Novo Nordisk about that, and we are trying to determine the feasibility of undertaking additional assessments, whether those are in new countries or expanding to different regions in Kenya and Senegal. So stay tuned. I will update you as I learn more.
Great, thanks. We've had another question in. Do you have, are you going to be able to share the actual country assessment tool that you have developed?
Yeah, again, that's a really good question. Because we developed these products using existing methodology but adapted them specifically for diabetes, they are really useful. We think that they're a really valuable output of the project, so we are hoping to make them publicly available. That is going to require additional support beyond what we currently have in our budget, so we are hoping that that is something that we can weave into the next phase of the project, which would start in early 2016. So we're still working all that out, but we do really want to make that available so countries can undertake these assessments on their own. And they don't have to be specific to diabetes. We have structured them in such a way that you could input whatever range of products you wanted to really look at, but it is a solid tool to be looking at both the supply chain as well as the price and availability of commodities.
Great, thank you, Bonnie. And just to close by also just really encouraging everyone to take a look at that report and also to sign the call to action, because I think it is a really, really useful advocacy tool that we can all be using to promote increased availability and affordability of essential medicines and technologies for NCDs. Thank you, Bonnie.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, over to our final agenda item on updates on the World Health Organization, and this is me presenting on this piece. So in terms of WHO updates, and I'll keep this fairly short, just partly because of time, and also just to flag that we're going to have another webinar. Our next webinar will be in the middle of January, and on that webinar we'll be doing a really comprehensive overview of the WHO Executive Board that's taking place on the week of the 25th of January. So this overview is just going to be quite short, and just to give you a quick kind of an update on where we are on WHO items. So firstly, just to talk through a recent meeting that I'm sure many of you attended or were able to dial in via webinar, was the WHO Global Coordination Mechanism Dialogue on NCDs and international collaboration, which took place right at the end of November. Interestingly, before this dialogue, so this is the second dialogue that the GCM has held. The first one was earlier this year in April. But for this dialogue, interestingly, they had a number of different caucuses that were taking place before the actual official meeting. There were three different caucuses, one organised by the UN system, one organised by NGOs, which was the NCD Alliance and the Young Professionals Chronic Disease Network together, and another one was by the private sector, which was organised by the World Economic Forum. And just to give you a quick overview of the NGO caucus that we organised. It was on the 29th of November, and we were pleased to have 44 participants, which ranged from NGOs, youth organisations, and also academia. We conducted a survey before we went into the actual caucus to really ask delegates from the NGO community what they saw as the kind of main barriers, the main challenges, and the main opportunities in terms of international cooperation and NCDs. Just to give you an interesting a few different points that came out of that survey, and we really used that survey to inform the meeting. The foremost pressing barriers that were identified by people who responded to that survey in terms of international cooperation were things like a lack of prioritisation and poor implementation of strategies, policies and plans at the national level, so really highlighting that gap of global commitments down to national implementation. Secondly, in terms of a lack of data at the national level on NCDs, which continues to be a challenge. Thirdly, a barrier that was identified was lack of coordination across sectors and the absence of policy coherence, which is obviously so important, particularly in the area of sustainable development, and a lack of financial resources for action on NCDs, which is obviously a continuous challenge in the NCD community. So what happened at that caucus was that the NGO caucus came out with three specific recommendations to take into the official GCM meeting that took place the day after. And those recommendations were, number one, it was directed more towards the actual GCM itself, to really try and clarify what the role was of non-state actors, i.e. NGOs and the private sector, in the GCM itself. So particularly looking at the terms of reference for the GCM. So how could we, what's our official role in the GCM and how can we engage more? And also a recommendation was around the actual working group process for the GCM as well, which went into the official meeting. Secondly, we had a recommendation from Member States, which was to improve tracking of resources for NCDs, which continues to be a major problem. And that's particularly a problem within the area of development assistance for health, because there's no specific purpose code for NCDs in the way that OECD tracks development assistance for health. So we really highlighted that as an issue that we would see being a priority going forward. And then we also had recommendations for ourselves for civil society, including improving coordination and joint advocacy, particularly towards the next UN high-level review that's taking place in 2018, to really try and prioritise integrated accountability frameworks, because obviously there's so much focus now on accountability, quite rightly, in terms of Sustainable Development Goals, universal health coverage and NCDs. And so there was a real push to try and make sure that these accountability frameworks were integrated. For us to really try and focus on reaching out to non-health sectors, we haven't done that so well over the last few years, and for the NCD Alliance anyway, it's very much a priority for us going forward in terms of making those linkages and common agendas with other areas of sustainable development. And finally, to integrate NCDs into health systems, strengthening efforts and universal health coverage. So this is what we came out from an NGO caucus perspective and took into the official dialogue. Next slide, please. And then so we went into the official dialogue, which took place on the 30th of November to the 1st of December in Geneva. 250 people were at this second dialogue, and the whole purpose, obviously, of the GCM is really to try and mobilise multi-sectoral action on NCD. So it was very much a multi-sectoral meeting with member states, with UN agencies, civil society, patient voices, which are so important, academia and the private sector. And a number of themes really from our perspective came out of the dialogue. For example, the need to really prioritise domestic policies for NCD prevention and control, to really try and build the capacity of governments to ensure policy coherence, which obviously was something that we had highlighted in our caucus the day before. That there's no notable increase in official development assistance for health for NCDs predicted. Obviously, this is a major kind of narrative coming out, particularly of the bilateral development agencies at the moment, that they're not going to increase their allocation of funding to NCDs, and that we need to focus much more on the domestic level. And obviously, their taxation systems are so important, which was obviously a recommendation in the Financing for Development conference that took place earlier this year in July. Another theme that came out quite strongly was the importance of what some people refer to as sin taxes, but really focusing particularly on tobacco taxation as a win-win strategy going forward. Integration was a hot topic, as it always is. Really looking at how we can better integrate NCDs into health systems, strengthening and universal health coverage, but really focusing on what does that actually look like. What are good practices in integration of NCDs into service delivery platforms in low middle income countries, and really pulling those good practices and sharing them globally much better. Richard Horton published a comment recently actually after the GCM dialogue as a reflection, because he was there as a moderator, and really emphasised the importance of NCDs as the social justice issue of our time. He also included some quite controversial statements about the NCD community being in a semi-comatose state, which was interesting, but I think he does highlight some interesting points around the fact that the NCD community can tend to be quite polite at times, and perhaps we need to learn from our HIV/AIDS NGO friends in really trying to drill forward the activism that we need to push the agenda forward. And then finally, accountability came out very strongly, with some people saying that perhaps we're being too quiet on that side. Obviously, the RMNCH community is very strong on accountability, particularly independent accountability, and so the NCD community could be a bit stronger in that regard. So these were just a few themes that came out of the meeting from our perspective anyway. And then there are a number of different follow-up items from the GCM dialogue, and the first one I wanted to mention was this GCM NCD virtual discussion forum that was announced at the meeting, and since then a communication has been sent round clarifying the dates of it. So we now know that the GCM NCD virtual discussion forum will be open from the 18th to the 27th of January next year. Registration will be open until the 8th of December, which has gone, but I'm assuming that will be extended because we only just recently heard about it anyway. And it will be a moderated online discussion, so it's essentially a new GCM activity. There will be two moderators, we understand. It will be Richard Horton from the Lancet and also Bente Nicholson, who is the head of the GCM Secretariat. And the real objectives of the virtual discussion is around sharing knowledge, sharing experiences, successes, challenges to mobilise, strengthen and focus international cooperation on NCDs. So it's really taking the theme of the dialogue and allowing for a broader discussion with other people who couldn't be in the room in Geneva. So allowing for more voices to be heard on this important topic. We understand that the outcomes of the discussion forum will be included in the report which the WHO GCM Secretariat will prepare on the outcomes of the recent dialogue. So essentially they're connecting the dialogue meeting with this virtual discussion platform. And we understand that report will be ready in February 2016. And we've included the link at the bottom there of how you can register. So I really encourage you to take a look at that and think about whether you would be interested in registering. Secondly, just another point on GCM activities. So as you'll be aware, two working groups were convened for this year, one focused on financing for NCDs, the second focused on the engagement of the private sector. We understand that both of those working groups will be finalising their report and they will be expected to submit their report to the Director General by this month. They won't be included in the WHO executive documents as we understand, but there is a potential for a drafting group at the Executive Board to ensure consideration by Member States at the World Health Assembly. From our perspective, that's quite an important part to make sure that these reports are being fed into the WHO governing bodies. So we would be really promoting the idea of having some kind of group that would then be promoting it to the World Health Assembly in May 2016. In terms of the working groups for the next couple of years, so 2016 to 2017, there'll be 3 new working groups. We understand that the first 2, so integration into other programmatic areas such as HIV/AIDS, sexual reproductive health and rights, and the alignment of international cooperation with national plans, those both will take place in 2016. And then the third one around education and health literacy is likely to take place in 2017. Now, just as the previous working group process happened, we understand that this one will happen in the same way. So in terms of membership of those working groups, member states are able to nominate experts that they would like to be on those working groups. And they have until the end of January to nominate experts, and they do that to their own WHO regional directors. And then once all of those names have been collated from the regions, then it will be at the headquarters level that they will decide who are on those working groups. So NCD Alliance has been doing its own advocacy around this issue to make sure that we've got strong people on all of those 3 working groups, but we really do encourage everyone else to do the same, because obviously these working groups are important in terms of providing reports and recommendations for progressing NCDs. And really the composition of those working groups are really key. Next slide, please. So then now moving on to the WHO Executive Board, the 138th WHO Executive Board, which is taking place on the 25th of January to the 30th. So far, in terms of what we know, the provisional agenda has been published on the EB138 website, along with a number of papers. So we now know what the agenda looks like. However, a number of the papers haven't yet been published. So this is why this is going to be a very short presentation, and we'll go into much more detail in January in our next webinar. But just to say that NCDs are agenda item number 6. And that includes a number of different sub-items. They've got maternal, infant and young child nutrition as one sub-item. Really importantly for us is 6.3 on preparations for the 3rd UN high-level meeting on NCDs. And we understand that there's going to be a number of different annexes to the paper, the NCD paper, which will include the process to review Appendix 3 from the Global NCD Action Plan. And that will be noted by member states, so it won't be really a decision. It will mainly just be noted on the process to update Appendix 3 in the Global NCD Action Plan. As a reminder, that was quite a contentious issue around the development of the action plan, and we'll really be looking at what are those technical, priority interventions that we're promoting to governments, and so that's an important process. Secondly, there will be an annex on a process to develop a non-state actor register, which will essentially be for both the private sector and for NGOs to register their commitment to NCDs, and in a way a different kind of accountability mechanism in that regard. And again, that one will be endorsed by member states. Thirdly, there'll be an update on where we are with the GCM NCD, with the GCM in general, but it won't include, as I say, the working group reports. And then fourthly, there'll be a progress report on the Global Action Plan, also a progress report on the achievement of the 9 global targets, which will be measured by the 25 outcome indicators. There will also be, we understand, a report from the Secretariat on GAP implementation, so Global NCD Action Plan implementation, and an update on a really important element of the financing discussions. So there might be a technical paper which looks at the development of an NCD purpose code for the OECD creditor reporting system, which all sounds completely complex, but it's basically just going back to that point I made earlier about the lack of availability of data on how much development assistance for health is allocated to NCDs. And so with an NCD purpose code in the OECD tracking system, we'll be able to see how much is being allocated in the future. And they're currently doing a consultation on this, and so we're hoping that the technical paper will be ready for the EB. The only other one which is not on the slide, we understand there will also be a paper on the contours of the Director General Progress Report to the UN General Assembly in 2017. So that will again be really important. WHO is due to publish a report that will feed into the 2018 UN High-Level Review, and so that paper will be providing the contours of that progress report. So moving on to some of the other agenda items, we will also have an item on the special session of the 2016 UN General Assembly on the world drug problem. The fifth agenda item will be on WHO reform. The main point of that will be around the continuing discussions around the framework of engagement with non-state actors. We understand member states met on December the 7th to 9th to further discuss that framework for engagement. And the intention is for it to be finalised and adopted by the time we get to the World Health Assembly. But no doubt we'll be hearing more updates from outcomes of that meeting shortly, and we'll be able to provide you more information in January. Agenda item number 7 is on promoting health throughout the life course. I think a particularly interesting paper here is on 7.2, which is health in the 2030 agenda. I really encourage everyone to read this one because it does make some important recommendations for the implications of health in the Sustainable Development Goals and what this means both for a WHO perspective, but also just more broadly in terms of global health governance, in terms of financing, and in terms of monitoring and follow-up and review. And it makes a few mentions of NCDs within that as well, obviously. And then moving on to, we've also got, moving on to the next slide, because I'm conscious of time. We've also got an agenda item on preparedness, surveillance and response, communicable diseases, and a number of items around health systems and a draft global strategy on human resources for health workforce for 2030. So a lot of important items from our perspective, and as I say, we'll be doing much more of a deep dive into the Executive Board at our next webinar in the middle of January. Next slide, please. Just quickly also just to mention that there's an important meeting taking place shortly after the Executive Board, which will be in the middle of February, 15th to the 17th of February. I'm sure many of you will have heard of this. that WHO will be convening, I think for the first time, all of their national NCD directors from around the world. It will be held at WHO headquarters in Geneva. And so it will be almost like a government WHO meeting, just like our Global NCD Alliance Forum was for civil society. The focus of it will be to really help countries achieve the commitments already been made on NCDs, including the 2011 Political Declaration and the recent UN Review outcome document, but really focusing on those 4 time-bound commitments that were made at the UN Review last year. We understand at the moment that participation will be restricted to member states only, but there will be an opportunity on one of the evenings, potentially on day 2, so the 16th of February, for a marketplace space, which will be much more multi-sectoral, and there'll be opportunities for civil society and private sector to engage with the NCD focal points. So I'll leave it there for now on that one, but just to say that we'll, as soon as we've got more information on the NCD focal points meeting, we'll share that with you and present that on our next webinar. Okay, I don't see any questions currently, so because we're running over time, let's just go straight into the final agenda item, which is looking ahead, and then I can come back to questions right at the end. So looking ahead to 2016, I just wanted to flag both the new NCD Alliance strategic plan and some of our advocacy priorities for next year. So just to give a quick recap, we've had our strategic plan for 2012 to 2015. Earlier this year we commissioned an independent review of the NCD Alliance, which was conducted by Global Health Visions. You can access the report there, which is on our website. Based on that independent review, we have now developed our new strategic plan for 2016 to 2020. At the moment, we've got a strategic plan at a glance version available, but by the middle of January, we'll have the full version readily available on our website for people to download and to look at. But just to give you a quick kind of overview of where we're going over the next 5 years as the NCD Alliance. Next slide, please. So in terms of firstly in terms of our goals for the next 5 years, we've got long-term goals and mid-term goals. Our long-term goals are very much aligned with the UN Sustainable Development Goals and also with the global NCD targets that were adopted by member states at WHA. So obviously the 25 by 25, and then also the reduction of NCD mortality by a third by 2030, which is the Sustainable Development Goal for NCDs. But in terms of the mid-term goals, which are much more about what we're going to be achieving over the next 5 years, we've got 3 focus areas. One, on integrating NCDs as a priority in global, regional and national health and development planning and implementation. So really trying to catalyse that shift from global commitments down to national and regional level. Secondly, to focus on mobilising adequate and sustainable financial and human resources for NCD prevention and control at all levels. Very much builds upon the points I was making around the GCM dialogue, financing being a continuing issue and priority for the NCD community. And then thirdly, to improve the capacity and sustainability of national and regional civil society alliances and organisations in low and middle-income countries particularly, to effectively influence NCD prevention and control. And this is very much because the NCD Alliance's strategy really builds and is based around the belief that a strong civil society movement is absolutely essential in terms of accelerating NCD prevention and control at all different levels. Next slide, please. So in order to deliver on those long-term and mid-term goals, we have 4 main strategies. And this is where we slightly depart from our previous strategic plan. First and foremost, continuing global advocacy, which has obviously been the main focus of us as an alliance over the last 5 years, and we'll continue to maintain political momentum, particularly on the Sustainable Development Goals. But our second pillar is a new area for us. It's on accountability, and it does build upon a point that I made around the GCM dialogue. We really see ourselves playing much more of a role in championing accountability for both commitments, for resources and for results in the NCD space. We've started to do this through championing things like civil society monitoring initiatives at the country level. But we'll be really increasing and expanding our focus in this area going forward. Thirdly, our third pillar is on capacity building, and this very much builds off the Global NCD Alliance Forum that Cristina presented on earlier. We're really going to increase our focus in this area as well, because we really see the need and the demand for strengthening the capacity of NCD organisations and alliances at national and regional levels, particularly focusing on low and middle income countries, which was a very strong recommendation that came out of that situational analysis of national and regional alliances that Cristina mentioned earlier. And then fourthly, our fourth pillar is on knowledge exchange. Obviously, a unique comparative advantage of an alliance is that we can identify good practice from all different parts of the world and share them and promote them in different regions and contexts. So we're really going to be increasingly playing a role in brokering knowledge on NCD evidence, policy and practice. Obviously, we've produced policy briefs over the years, but really focusing on what works in NCD prevention and control going forward. Next slide, please. So just drilling down just briefly into 2016, we'll be going into more detail on this again in January. Our priorities for the year ahead are really fivefold. Firstly, looking at Agenda 2030, so the Sustainable Development Goals, obviously continuing to keep track and engaging and influencing the indicator process that, as Priya mentioned earlier, will be culminating in March of 2016. Really focusing also on the follow-up and review process around the Sustainable Development Goals, which is also still being determined and defined. And that will be a point of discussion at the Executive Board and is part of that paper I mentioned earlier. But also obviously really focusing on how we can translate the integration of NCDs into the Sustainable Development Goals at the global level into national and regional levels. And this is going to need really sustained advocacy because it's not going to happen overnight. Governments are going to be continuing with their existing priorities, and it's going to take a lot of advocacy and persuasion and effort from civil society to really begin to adjust those priorities to bring NCDs into the game. Secondly, to strengthen the linkages between NCDs and other areas of sustainable development. Jess was presenting earlier on climate change and the environment as one example of where we've begun to do this. But other areas that we'll be focusing on, particularly next year, is around HIV/AIDS, because the International AIDS Conference will be taking place in July in Durban in South Africa, and then also the UN High-Level Review on HIV/AIDS will be taking place in New York. So it's a really good opportunity for us to be promoting our shared agenda with the HIV/AIDS communities, really. But obviously other areas as well, such as sustainable cities and the environment, with the UN Habitat 3 conference taking place in Ecuador near the end of the year as an opportunity again for promoting NCDs in that space. Thirdly, as I've constantly repeated, the issue around financing for NCDs will be a focus of ours. As I said, WHO are developing that technical paper on how we can develop a purpose code for NCDs in the OECD creditor reporting system. So we'll be keeping a close eye on that and making sure that it reflects the views and perspectives of the NCD community, but also following up more broadly on the Financing for Development Conference outcomes that happened in Addis in July last year, which had very strong recommendations, obviously, around tobacco taxation, which was great. Fourthly, moving more towards WHO in Geneva, are a lot of the items that I mentioned earlier about the EB, which is the review of Appendix 3, which sounds very technical and processy, but it is an important element because those are really our priority interventions that many governments are adopting and adapting for their own country context. So we need to make sure that what's in Appendix 3 reflects the views of civil society. Also that non-state actor register that I mentioned, and also the GCM working groups that I spoke about. And then finally, even though it seems like a long way away, the UN high-level review on NCDs will be a focus for us from next year onwards, because we really need to make sure that there is a long preparatory process in the lead-up to the next review. I don't think there was a substantial preparatory process towards the 2014 review, and so we will be working very closely with WHO to ensure that happens next time around. So that, in a nutshell, is our kind of advocacy priorities for 2016 and beyond. So just to close, I realise that we're completely over time this time round. It must be the end of the year. So we had one question from Craig, which is, with everything going on in the NCD space, is there a calendar of events available for key events of the NCD Alliance that we'll focus on in 2016? And also in terms of NCD cafes that we have been organising. The answer, Craig, is absolutely yes. We'll be sharing a calendar of events early next year, and we also have a section on our website which also includes key events coming up. But yes, we'll certainly be sharing a calendar of key events in the new year. And with that, I think we haven't got any other questions. So I'd like to thank all of our presenters today for giving excellent presentations. I should highlight that we'll be sharing the slides as always via our e-alert, and they'll be available on our website. And just to say, I hope everybody has a happy holiday season and a very happy New Year to everyone. And we'll, as I say, be in touch about our next webinar. And that concludes our webinar for today. Thank you.